Hi guys.
In times when seas were yet uncharted and horizons seemed like the edge of existence, Egypt was ruled by a king who liked to call himself brother of a brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Not because he had enough brothers to fill an army, but because he believed knowledge, like family, should never be left alone. Somewhere in the heart of Alexandria, between the bustling port and the gleaming white temples, he dreamed of building a place where all human wisdom would gather. Not that of gods or warriors, but of reason itself. The idea, of course, wasn't new. Like most brilliant ideas, it was born from greed. The king wanted a library, but not the kind that stored scrolls of taxes or slave inventories. He wanted to collect everything: Babylonian laws, Indian healing recipes, Phoenician sailors' songs, even the silly poems lovers wrote under palm trees. To achieve this, he devised a trick worthy of a carpet merchant. Every ship arriving in Alexandria had to surrender its books for temporary safekeeping. Guards searched the holds as thoroughly as if they were hunting stolen princesses. If they found a text, it was immediately taken to the library, where scribes copied it until their fingers turned black with ink. The original was kept in the king's treasury, and the merchant received a copy with the inscription, "Donated to the Library of Alexandria." Merchants, of course, grumbled. One Phoenician, whose grandmother had once recorded how to tame storms with songs, nearly started a riot at the dock. He stood waving his arms like a windmill and shouting that his ancestors had guarded these secrets for generations, and now they'd be taken like the last fig from a starving camel. But when he was handed a bag of gold for his donation, his anger melted faster than snow in the desert. So it went. Merchants' fury turned into a sly smile. Some began slipping fake scrolls into their chests with nonsense like how to turn sand into water, hoping to earn gold for empty chatter. Others hid valuable manuscripts in barrels of olive oil, unaware that guards had learned to sniff out the scent of ink even through resin. The library itself grew like the Nile in flood season. Its halls resembled a labyrinth where every turn led to a new wonder. Here lay Babylonian astronomers' tables that could predict eclipses as easily as a housewife foretold rain. There, instructions from Egyptian doctors on how to reset a dislocated jaw with a stick and rope. Sometimes odd things turned up. A scroll on growing gold from clay. The author had clearly drunk too much Phoenician wine. Or notes from a Persian poet who spent 3 days describing how beautifully a rose petal fell. The king, however, didn't distinguish between valuable and worthless texts. For him, one thing mattered. If a single handwritten word existed somewhere in the world, it had to end up here. The copying process became a craft, almost a religion. In the library's cellars, where the air smelled of lavender to keep moths away, and lamp oil, scribes worked. Their hands moved as quickly as if afraid the ink would dry before they could capture the wisdom of the ages. Young apprentices holding reed pens for the first time often stained their fingers and scrolls, while senior masters sighed like grandmothers watching their grandchildren's mischief. One such youth, Sosibius, became famous for mixing up letters in Euclid's formula and writing square hippopotamus instead of square of the hypotenuse. Scholars debated for a week whether the Greek had discovered square hippos until someone noticed a wine stain on the scroll. From then on, Sosibius was made to write in gloves. and he wore them even in his sleep. But not everything ran smoothly. One day, a fire broke out in the port. Someone dropped a lamp near a barrel of oil. Flames crept toward the warehouse where fresh scrolls were stored, scrolls not yet copied. Scholars ran about like headless chickens, trying to save what they could. Someone threw a stack of manuscripts straight into the Nile, hoping water would stop the fire. Later, when the panic subsided, they fished out the soggy scraps, but the ink had bled, turning wise thoughts into abstract patterns. Then an elderly Egyptian priest stepped in, the kind who had probably been waiting for this moment his whole life. He suggested mixing ink with acacia sap, a plant growing in the desert. It turned out thick as clay and unafraid of water or time. From then on, all important texts were written with this mixture, and the priest received a lifetime supply of figs and the right to sleep in the library on a mat of palm leaves. Over time, Alexandria became not just a port, but a giant vacuum cleaner for knowledge. Merchants from distant lands, hearing that books were paid for in gold, began deliberately bringing scrolls, even if they previously only carried spices and slaves. One Greek trading olive oil hired a poet to write an ancient manuscript overnight about a hero who defeated a sea monster with a spoon. Guards believed it, took the scroll to the library, and the merchant got his gold. Later, it turned out the poet had simply rewritten the story of Perseus, replacing the sword with a spoon. But the king wasn't even angry. He decided humor was also part of human wisdom. Not everyone welcomed this enterprise with enthusiasm. In Athens, for instance, philosophers turned up their noses. What were Greek thoughts doing rotting in Egyptian dust? But when they learned the Library of Alexandria held original works by Aristotle that had already rotted from rain in Athens, their pride softened somewhat. Even Romans, usually dismissive of foreign books, sent a messenger requesting a copy of the legal code. Their own records seemed to have vanished into Senate dust. The library grew, but so did its problems. Scrolls multiplied so fast that a storage system had to be devised. At first, they were stored in jars like grain, but mice quickly learned to gnaw through clay. Then wooden shelves were built, but sea humidity made the planks swell, and scrolls curled up like frightened snakes. Finally, following a Babylonian architect's advice, stone niches with sand at the bottom were constructed. Sand absorbed moisture, and scrolls lay as if in a pharaoh's tomb. Each library section got its color: green for medicine, blue for astronomy, red for poetry, though poets were offended to be mixed with blood. Sometimes texts arrived that even the king lost his composure over. For example, a scroll in a strange language where birds and fish replaced letters. Scholars puzzled over it for 3 months until they realized it was an Indian cipher where each bird represented a syllable, or a papyrus with a formula for eternal youth, written so small it had to be read through an ice magnifying glass. Later, it turned out to be just a wine recipe. But by then, the king had already ordered ice spectacles for the entire court. Over time, the library became more than a book repository. Scholars gathered here to debate whether Earth was flat or round, whether the distance to the moon could be measured, and whether water turning into wine was even believable. Sometimes arguments turned into fights. Once, an astronomer and a geographer nearly killed each other because the first drew a map without desert, and the second claimed desert was a myth. The king, hearing about it, merely smirked. Let them fight. While they argue who's right, we'll collect both versions. But the biggest problem wasn't arguments or mice. Knowledge, like wine, changed taste over time. Scribes copying scrolls sometimes added their comments, or worse, skipped entire paragraphs, deciding they were obvious nonsense. A philosophical treatise on the nature of the soul reached posterity with a marginal note. The author clearly drank too much. Souls can't be blue. A plague remedy recipe acquired notes like, "Try adding garlic, worked for my aunt." The king, learning of this, issued a new decree. All comments must be written in red ink so they'd be visible. Thus, the world's first standard for scientific annotations was born. By the end of Ptolemy's reign, the library had become legend. Merchants joked that if a single word existed anywhere not written on papyrus, it would still find its way to Alexandria. Once, a ship arrived from an unknown island, and the captain gifted the king a scroll woven from spider silk. It showed stars and strange symbols. Scholars spent 3 years trying to decipher it. Was it a map of distant islands or just a madman's drawing? It turned out to be a letter from Polynesian islanders who navigated by stars. But by then, the ship had long sailed away, and the captain had probably forgotten why he'd done it. So the library grew, not perfect, not flawless, but alive. It contained mistakes, deceptions, silly jokes, and brilliant discoveries. But every line, even the most absurd, reminded, knowledge isn't just truth. It's also the people who write it, copy it, lose it, and find it again. The king, perhaps, didn't know that one day this labyrinth of scrolls would burn, crumble to dust, or sink into sand. But in those years when Nile dust mixed with ink and scholars' laughter drowned out the sea's roar, Alexandria was the closest place to what people call eternity. Sometimes, though, eternity smelled of lavender and rancid oil, and tomorrow would be a new day. New scrolls. New mistakes. But that was another story. If the library's first problem was gathering books, the second was realizing knowledge doesn't always wear a toga or sit in chests. Sometimes it hides in desert sands, in old priests' whispers, or in drawings on clay shards. King Ptolemy, seeing how quickly the library's halls expanded, suddenly understood. What if somewhere far away, beyond his port, secrets lay hidden that he couldn't even imagine? Like in Babylon, where astronomers predicted falling stars, or in India, where doctors removed tumors and stitched wounds with monkey intestine thread. So he gathered the boldest, the most cunning, those who could fool even a fox if the fox could read. These people didn't wear armor or carry swords. Their weapons were bags of Egyptian linen, bottles of wine, and the ability to lie as if telling the truth. They were nicknamed collectors, though in essence, they were thieves in silk. The first mission was sent to Babylon, the city where towers reached for the sky and scholars knew more than gods. Ptolemy chose 3, Callimachus, who could memorize an entire scroll at a glance, Lysander, a master of spontaneous storytelling, and young Theocritus, who still confused left with right, but could go a month without eating if asked. The road to Babylon was long, first up the Nile by boat, then across the desert on donkeyback. The desert, as always, didn't appreciate haste. Sand got into bags, water ran out faster than promised, and at night, The cold forced them to sleep, huddled like puppies. But the collectors comforted themselves. If they died, their names wouldn't be recorded in the library, and that was worse than death. When they reached Babylon, the city greeted them with the scent of cinnamon and clay. Here, knowledge wasn't stored on papyrus, but on clay tablets, durable as Babylonian officials' temperaments. To access them, the collectors devised a plan worthy of a drunk poet. Lysander declared himself an envoy of the Egyptian king bringing gifts. Callimachus, disguised as a priest, began interpreting dreams on the streets to gather followers. And Theocritus, the most useless of the three, handed out sweets made of figs and almonds to children, hoping they'd lead him to scholars' homes. Within a week, they knew everything: where astronomical tables were kept, how Babylonian sages counted years, and most importantly, that local officials hated being reminded their great city had once been destroyed. Then Lysander took a risk. He appeared at the temple of Marduk with a bag of linen, the finest in the world, used to swaddle Pharaoh's infants. "King Ptolemy gifts this to the god," he announced. "But if your priests refuse, we'll take it to Syria. Their gods, they say, have sensitive skin." The priests, of course, couldn't resist. The linen was too good to refuse. In exchange for 10 pieces of cloth, they gave the collectors a bundle of clay tablets, with eclipse tables, star lists, and even instructions on building towers so they wouldn't collapse. Later it turned out the last part was a joke. Babylonians themselves didn't know why their towers fell. But the collectors didn't ask. They packed the tablets in straw-filled sacks like fragile wine and headed further, to India, where, according to rumor, doctors stitched wounds so well no scars remained. The road to India proved worse. Deserts gave way to jungles where trees clung to the sky and snakes were longer than Theocritus's patience. In one city, they were nearly eaten by tigers. In another, almost drowned in a river mistaken for spies. But the worst awaited them in the Raja's capital, a city where gold was cheaper than clay, and doctors operated so quickly, patients didn't have time to get scared. The collectors learned the Raja possessed a scroll, ancient, parchment, written in a language resembling bird tracks. It described operations Egyptian doctors considered nonsense: removing kidney stones, mending broken bones with wooden splints, even restoring sight to the blind. But the Raja guarded it like treasure, and taking it by force meant inviting the wrath of 1,000 warriors. So Lysander devised a new lie. He announced King Ptolemy had sent the Raja the world's rarest wine, actually ordinary Phoenician wine laced with a sleeping potion Callimachus learned from Egyptian priests. At the feast, the Raja drank 3 cups and fell asleep like a baby. While his servants danced and sang, the collectors sneaked into the treasury. There, among ivory and jewels, lay the scroll tied with a silk ribbon. Theocritus, trembling with fear, stuffed it under his robe, and Callimachus, just in case, hid a couple of math books. Might come in handy. But as they left the palace, they walked into an ambush. It turned out the Raja had woken up early and noticed the theft. Warriors surrounded the collectors at the city gates. Lysander, as always, began talking about friendship between nations, how the scroll was a gift from the gods, that they'd only temporarily borrowed it for copying. But the Raja wasn't convinced. Then Callimachus did what he should have done long ago. He threw the scroll into Theocritus's hands and shouted, "Run!" Theocritus ran. Through narrow alleys, past shouting traders, across a bridge over the river. Arrows whistled past, but he didn't stop. Only when the city was behind him did he hide the scroll in a staff, specially hollowed out like oars on a boat. Then he sat on the ground and cried. Because he knew Callimachus and Lysander wouldn't catch up. They didn't. They were caught. Lysander was executed for deception. Callimachus was thrown into prison. But before dying, he scratched star coordinates into the wall so someone might one day find their path. And Theocritus, alone with his staff, walked through the desert. Water ran out. Cracks appeared on his skin like on a clay pot. Sometimes he thought he heard Lysander's laughter or Callimachus's cough, but it was just the wind playing with sand. When he reached Alexandria, they barely recognized him. His cloak had turned to rags, his face was crusted with salt, and he clutched the staff like his last hope. King Ptolemy personally met him in the library. Theocritus silently pulled out the scroll and placed it on the table. Then he collapsed. Scholars rushed to the manuscript. Indian letters danced before their eyes, but they knew it was worth it. The scroll was translated, copied, displayed in the medicine hall, and Theocritus's staff was placed in a corner, a memorial to those who didn't return. From then on, people in Alexandria said, "Not all books come by ship. Some come from the desert, from jungles, from roads where those who brought them died." And every time a scribe picked up a new scroll, he remembered. Behind every line lay someone's life, someone's lie, someone's hope. But not all missions ended tragically. Once, a Chinese merchant arrived at the library, with silk, porcelain, and a scroll where birds replaced letters. Scholars puzzled over it for 3 months until they realized it wasn't language, but music. Each bird was a note. They played the melody on a lyre, and the hall filled with the scent of flowers that never grew in Egypt. The king ordered the scroll placed next to astronomical tables. "Let stars and notes be friends," he said. And a year later, a ship from Africa arrived at the port, with a box full of black beans. "For alertness," explained the merchant. In the library, they tried the beans, brewed them in water, and named the drink coffee. Now scribes worked through the night without falling asleep from fatigue. So the collectors continued their work. Some returned with gold and glory, some with empty hands, some didn't return at all. But every mission reminded one thing. Knowledge doesn't ask permission to enter the world. It comes when sought. Even if it means deceiving a Raja, fleeing warriors, or walking through the desert with only a staff. Sometimes, though, knowledge came on its own. Once, an old fisherman wandered into the library and brought a papyrus found in a fish's belly. It showed a map of a non-existent island. Scholars decided it was a joke, but 100 years later, Columbus used the same map to find America. And Theocritus? He stayed in Alexandria, became keeper of the medicine hall, taught young scribes how to read Indian letters. And every evening before sleep, he'd take Callimachus's staff and whisper, "We brought back your scroll. Now it's your turn." But the wind never answered. The wind never answers. And somewhere in the desert, a hollow staff waited for the next hand to pick it up. Picture this. Morning. First sunbeams barely touch Alexandria's rooftops, while lamps already burn in the library's cellars. There, where it smells of lavender, dust, and something sweet. Perhaps souring wine, perhaps hope. Here, in the House of Scrolls, copies of those very secrets are born, the ones arriving by ship or brought from deserts. And here, between reed pens and ink blots, lies the quietest yet most important work in the world. Scribes aren't heroes. Their names aren't carved on temple walls. They aren't mentioned in songs. But without them, everything we know about antiquity would long ago have turned to ash. Their task is simple: transfer letters from one papyrus to another. But simplicity is deceptive. Try writing symbols you don't understand for hours, keeping your hand steady as a taut string without mixing inks. And don't fall asleep. Because if the pen slips, the mistake remains forever, like a scar on an immortal's face. Let's start with morning. Lamplight flickers, casting shadows on walls. Tables covered with papyri resemble battlefields. Here and there, traces of man's struggle with letter. Somewhere the pen pierced the papyrus. Somewhere ink bled like blood. And in this chaos, silence. Only the scratch of pens, rustle of pages, and an occasional sigh from a tired master. Sometimes someone sneezes, and everyone jumps as if startled by a snake. Among newcomers is Sosibius, a youth with ink-stained fingers and eyes full of hope. He's been here only a month but already knows. Copying isn't the same as reading. Reading is like drinking water, simple, natural. Copying is like catching fish in the dark. Sometimes you catch a pearl, sometimes a stone. Yesterday, he mixed up 2 letters in Euclid's formula and wrote square hippopotamus instead of square of the hypotenuse. Scholars debated for a week whether the Greek had discovered square hippos until someone noticed a wine stain on the scroll. Today, Sosibius writes in gloves and wears them even in his sleep. Beside him sits Demetrius, an old master whose fingers are crooked from work, whose eyes see letters even in darkness. They say he began writing before Ptolemy built the library. His hands move like mechanisms, every motion precise, every line perfect. But today he isn't writing. Today he's teaching. Look, he whispers to Sosibius, pointing at a scroll. Here's a dot, tiny, nearly invisible. If it's missing, the whole meaning vanishes. Like saying, the king loves bread instead of, the king loves bread. Imagine what happens if bread runs out. Sosibius nods, but thinks only of breakfast. Demetrius notices. You think knowledge is about the mind, he continues. Number knowledge is about hands, about not flinching while writing, about remembering. Every letter is like a drop of water in the Nile. One disappears, the river becomes shallower. Sosibius nods again, but in his head, only breakfast. The day drags slowly. Sun climbs higher, lamps go out, but it's still dark in the cellar. Scribes change positions, rub stiff necks, drink water from clay jugs. Sometimes someone falls off their chair from exhaustion, and everyone laughs because laughter here is rare as rain in the desert. By noon, Sosibius finishes a page, looks at it proudly. No blots, no mistakes. But Demetrius takes the scroll, squints, and quietly curses. Here it should be 3, he points at a numeral. You wrote 2. But so it's almost the same, Sosibius mumbles. Almost the same is like almost alive, Demetrius snaps. There's no almost in science. He takes a cloth, erases the mistake, and makes Sosibius rewrite it. 3 times, until his hand remembers. After lunch comes the hardest part. They bring a new scroll, Aristotle's treatise on animals. Text on brittle papyrus, letters faded, blurred in places. Scribes frown. Reading this is like deciphering a cipher. Sosibius takes it. Hands tremble, but he's focused. Gradually, letters form words, and since the horse's soul differs from man's, suddenly he freezes. In the text, a strange word. Not Greek, not Egyptian. Looks like a typo. He asks Demetrius. The old man studies the line for a long time, then snorts. That's not a typo. It's an Indian word. Means is soul. Aristotle must have read about it somewhere. But how did it get here? Who knows those Greeks? Demetrius sighs. Maybe a merchant sold a fake. Maybe Aristotle himself got confused. But our job isn't to think. Our job is to write. And so Eusebius writes, even if he doesn't understand, even if his hand aches. Because that's the House of Scrolls rule. If text exists, it must be preserved, even if it's wrong, even if it's foolish, even if it says the earth rests on 3 elephants. By evening, disaster strikes. One senior scribe, Philon, discovers an error in a copy of Euclid's Elements. Instead of parallel lines never meet, it reads, parallel lines meet in Ptolemy's house. This isn't just a mistake. It's a nightmare. Because now every scholar reading this scroll will think Euclid believed in miracles. And the king, by the way, isn't thrilled when his house gets compared to geometry. Philon runs between tables like a tailless monkey. Who's to blame? Who allowed such stupidity? Turns out the culprit is the newcomer, the same one who wrote about square hippos yesterday, Eusebius. He's summoned before Demetrius. The old master looks at him as if seeing through. Do you know what this means? He asks. Eusebius stays silent. It means that in 100 years, someone will read this and decide Euclid was mad, or that Ptolemy is a god. Maybe both. But I didn't mean to. Nobody means to. But mistakes happen. The question is what to do with them. Demetrius takes the scroll, tears out the ruined page, and throws it into the fire. Flames devour the words, and Eusebius feels something burning inside him too. Now you'll rewrite it, and you won't leave until it's perfect. Night. Everyone's gone except Eusebius. The lamp flickers, ink dries, and he writes. Line after line. Once, 10 times, 100 times, until the letters become what Euclid intended. By morning, he finishes, places the scroll on Demetrius's table. The old man checks it, silently nods, and smiles for the first time. Now you understand? He asks. What? That every letter is like a drop of water in the Nile. Eusebius nods, and for the first time feels he's not just writing, he's preserving. The next day, the king visits the library, not to praise, to ask, why in a star chart instead of coordinates are there drawings of monkeys? It turns out one collector returning from India decided monkeys were a new alphabet. Scholars laugh, scribes sigh, and Eusebius thinks, maybe knowledge isn't just formulas and maps. Maybe it's also monkeys that accidentally made it into history. But today he won't make a mistake. Today he'll write so that in 1,000 years someone can read his lines and understand. Here was a man who knew every letter matters. Because knowledge doesn't die. It just waits to be written correctly. And tomorrow will be a new day. New scrolls. New mistakes. But that's another story. Night. Alexandria's port usually buzzed until dawn. Creaking rigging, sailors' shouts, the smell of fish and salty wind. But this night, noise turned to fire's crackle. Someone dropped a lamp near an oil barrel. Or perhaps the gods decided to test how much King Ptolemy loved his books. Whatever the cause, flames crawled along the docks like a snake across sand, swallowing ships, chests, dreams. And in the holds, between wheat sacks and fig crates, lay fresh scrolls, those not yet copied, those for which collectors died in the desert. Panic erupted in the library. Scholars, usually calm as pharaoh statues, ran about like headless chickens. Some raced to the port with buckets of water, some to the scrolls, some just stood watching flames lick the stars. Sosibius, the scribe who nearly fell asleep over Euclid's Elements the night before, grabbed the first thing at hand, a bundle of papyri with Indian healing recipes, and sprinted to the Nile. There, without thinking, he threw them into the water. If fire doesn't reach them, water will stop it, he decided. But water stopped not the fire, but the letters. Ink bled, turning wise lines into abstract patterns. When Sosibius fished out the scrolls next morning, only bird-like stains remained. Not everyone was so foolish. Demetrius, the old scribe master, instead of water-grabbed sandbags. He knew, humidity destroys papyrus, but sand absorbs moisture like a sponge. Scrolls packed in bags were carried to safety, into Serapis temple cellars, where even mice feared to rustle. But sand didn't save everything. Fire reached the warehouse storing Babylonian clay tablets. They'd have survived the fire, but not the panic. In the chaos, someone dropped the stack, and tablets scattered like dice. Now even astronomers couldn't reconstruct the eclipse table from shards. By morning, the fire died. The port resembled a battlefield. Charred planks, ash instead of sand, the smell of soot that seemed embedded in skin. Scholars stood among ruins like lost children. Sosibius looked at the wet scrolls in his hands and thought, "It's over. Knowledge has gone into the Nile like Pharaoh's ashes." But then an old man emerged from the crowd. Not a scholar, not a soldier, an Egyptian priest who used to carry water to the library and sleep on a palm leaf mat. His name was Imhotep, but everyone called him the Fourth because he was the fourth in his line with that name. He approached the wet scrolls, took one, turned it in his hands, and smirked. Not maliciously, but as if he knew this would happen. Then he pulled something like dry grass from his bag and said, "Acacia sap. Smear it on ink. Won't wash off even in a flood." Everyone fell silent. Acacia sap? Desert grass? But the priest didn't explain. He simply coated ink on a papyrus scrap, dipped it in water, and the letters remained sharp as a sphinx's smile. It turned out the priest had known this for a long time. His grandfather used acacia sap for tomb inscriptions, so writings wouldn't fade over 1,000 years. But his grandfather wasn't a scholar. He was what Alexandrians called an ordinary man. And ordinary people, it turned out, sometimes knew more than those wearing togas and quoting Aristotle. Within a day, the library lived again. Not as before, now every corner smelled of smoke and fresh paint, but it lived. Scribes worked non-stop, mixing ink with acacia sap. Sosibius, who yesterday threw scrolls into the Nile, now taught newcomers. Coat the brush twice. First layer for the letter, second for eternity. Even mice, usually delighted by chaos, hid away. Something unfamiliar smelled in the air. But not everyone rejoiced. Some scholars grumbled, "Why do we need this desert grass?" Greek ink was fine. But when a new scroll survived rain, yes, Alexandria occasionally had rain, rarely, but enough to test, grumbling turned to silence. Within a week, King Ptolemy ordered, all important texts must be written with acacia sap. priest Imhotep IV was rewarded with a bag of figs and the right to sleep in the library, not on a mat, but on a real reed mat. The fire became a turning point, not just because inks changed, because everyone understood knowledge is fragile. It perishes not only from fire, but from water, wind, human stupidity who throws a scroll into a river thinking it saves it. Now new rules appeared in the library. No scrolls in the port without protection. All copies in 2 sets. And most importantly, if you think you know everything, you've already made a mistake. Once Sosibius asked Demetrius, "Why didn't we use acacia sap before?" The old master just sighed. Because before the fire, we didn't know it would come. It wasn't an answer. But perhaps the most honest one. Soon, a new scroll arrived from Carthage, showing ships and strange symbols. Scribes, now experienced, coated it with acacia sap and placed it in a sand-filled niche. But a month later, they discovered ink cracked. It turned out acacia sap doesn't mix with salt, so they devised mixing it with olive oil. When the oil began to turn rancid, they added a drop of wine. Thus, a recipe survived to our days. The fire didn't destroy the library. It changed it. Now knowledge wasn't just stored. It was learned to be protected. Special jars for scrolls appeared, which could be buried in sand. Underground storage began construction, where even fire couldn't reach. And at the port, guards with buckets were stationed, just in case. But most importantly, people stopped thinking knowledge was eternal. They understood every book, every scroll is a battle with fire, water, one's own stupidity. And victory can only be achieved by remembering today's mistake, tomorrow's ash. When fire broke out again in the port a year later, this time due to a sailor's joke with a lamp, scholars didn't run like chickens. They took buckets, sandbags, and new scrolls, those written with acacia sap. The fire died within an hour, and scrolls hidden in jars survived it, like pharaohs, for thousands of years. Sosibius, no longer a novice but not yet a master, looked at the smoke and thought, perhaps knowledge isn't what's written on papyrus. It's what remains when papyrus burns. Sometimes, though, only ash remains. But even ash can tell a story. And in the desert where acacia grows, the wind whispers to old trees, "Save what you can. The rest will find its way." The Moussaïon, not a temple, not a market, not a tavern, a place where thoughts clash like waves against rocks. Some shatter into dust, others find shore. Here, in the hall with columns where drafts whispered in 10 languages, scholars argued so fiercely scribes hid ink, lest chairs fly. Here swords weren't drawn, but words broke stronger than stone. And one day, an argument began not about how many stars were in the sky, but about the shape of Earth itself. It all started with a shadow. Eratosthenes, former poet and now library head, noticed, in Siena, now Aswan, on the summer solstice, the sun shines straight into wells, no shadow. But in Alexandria, there is a shadow. So Earth is round, he declared, and we can measure its circumference. For this, he needed scrolls from the library, Babylonian angle tables, Egyptian Nile maps, even Phoenician sailors' notes drawing the horizon as an arc. He took a stick, measured the shadow, calculated, and announced, Earth's circumference, 252,000 stadia. A figure that curled geographers' toes, but not everyone applauded. In a corner sat Aristarchus of Samos, a man who believed Earth was flat as a pancake, supported by 3 elephants, though elephants, in his view, stood on a tortoise, and the tortoise on something else. He didn't shout, didn't wave hands, just placed on the table a worn scroll, Persian, written before Alexander the Great began conquering the world. It said, "Earth is God's shield, heated and flat. Whoever claims otherwise lies or is drunk." Aristarchus smiled. "Here's proof. Your calculations are dice games with gods." The argument exploded. Some shouted Eratosthenes was a genius, others that he'd drunk too much wine and now saw round wells in his sleep. Someone drew arcs, triangles, tortoises with periscopes on the floor. Others pointed fingers at scrolls, proving India knew truth while Babylon lied. Scribes, usually quiet as mice, began arguing louder than anyone. If Earth's round, like a scroll, people on the other side live upside down. No, they're like us, just their Nile flows the other way. And if we flip, will we fall into the sky? Eratosthenes didn't give up. He laid out papyri before the crowd. Cyane's shadow, angle calculation, a map where ships disappeared over the horizon like snails into a shell. But Aristarchus played his trump card. What if the shadow is light's deception? Or eyes lie? You trust paper, I trust gods. And then a scene began where even pharaoh statues seemed to cover their ears. Someone suggested testing it. Hire a ship, sail south until seeing ships disappear over the edge of the world. Others laughed. Fools, you'll fall into the abyss. No, you'll fall when Earth flips. Third parties demanded burning Eratosthenes' scrolls to stop confusing people. One philosopher, mixing up wine with medicine, began proving Earth was a giant watermelon, and we lived on its rind. King Ptolemy, hearing of the argument, came to the Mausion not as a ruler, but as a spectator. He sat in a column's shade, chewed a fig, and watched scholars tread the line between genius and madness. At one point, Aristarchus grabbed Eratosthenes' scroll and cried, "This is a lie! Let's throw it in the fire, and the argument ends!" The crowd froze. Fire, which recently nearly took thousands of scrolls, now could become judge of truth. But Ptolemy stood up. Not loudly, not threateningly, simply raised his hand, as those accustomed to being listened to do. "Throw the scroll in the fire," he said, "and you'll prove only one thing: fear of knowledge. I want both versions kept here. Let future generations decide who's right, because truth isn't about not making mistakes. Truth is about comparing mistakes." The crowd fell silent. Aristarchus lowered the scroll. Eratosthenes nodded. And at that moment, the argument stopped being war. Now it was dialogue. Since then, a new rule appeared in the library. If two versions of one truth exist, both must be kept. In the geography hall, next to the round Earth map, hung the Persian scroll about the flat one. Next to Eratosthenes' works, placed the watermelon philosopher's notes, though he was later expelled for trying to prove seeds were continents. Scribes began writing not just text, but comments. This is Aristarchus's opinion. This is Eratosthenes' calculation. This is a drunk poet's nonsense. But what if it's true? Arguments didn't cease. They became longer, louder, more interesting. Sometimes scholars argued so much they forgot to eat. Sometimes, so much they dropped inkwells in anger. But now behind every argument lay the thought, what if tomorrow someone proves the opposite? One day, Eratosthenes and Aristarchus sat at the same table. Not as enemies, but as two ships sailing in different directions, but knowing the sea is one. Eratosthenes drew a circle, Aristarchus a square. Then they added a black dot, the place where we don't know, and smiled. Because even in argument, common ground can be found. New sections began appearing in the library, not just geography or astronomy, but debates. There lay scrolls with opposing theories, fanned out like flower petals. Someone wrote about the sun revolving around Earth. Someone, the opposite. Someone proved lightning was God's anger. Someone, that it could be caught in a jar. Later it turned out it could. Scribes, who once feared mistakes, now took pride. This scroll is a mistake, but it's important. Even Sosibius, the scribe who feared writing 2 instead of 3, began adding margin comments. Author believes Earth is flat. I think he hasn't seen ships disappear over the horizon. But maybe he's right. Demetrius, the old master, only sighed. Mistakes used to be erased. Now they're collected. But the strangest thing happened a year later. Aristarchus, still believing in a flat Earth, asked Ptolemy's permission for an expedition. "I'll prove the world's edge exists," he declared. The king agreed. Aristarchus sailed south and returned 3 months later. Not with proof of the world's edge, but with a new map. On it, the horizon was curved. "Turns out," he said, "I was wrong. But thanks to the library, it gave me a chance to err and redo." Eratosthenes smiled, not smugly, but like someone who knows. Winning an argument isn't about breaking the other. Winning is staying in the game. Since then, a tradition appeared in the Mausion. Whoever brought a new theory had to write on the scroll. This may be untrue, but I believe truth is somewhere nearby. Scribes laughed. Now even mistakes are signed like poets. But they did it because they understood. Knowledge grows not in silence, but in argument's noise. Sometimes arguments went too far. Once, 2 philosophers argued whether thought speed could be measured. One claimed thought was faster than light, the other slower than a snail. In the end, they held a race, sitting in a corner, thinking the same thing, while scribes noted whose hand first reached for ink. The winner was the one thinking about food, but even such foolishness left a trace. Because in the library, foolishness wasn't feared. Only one thing was feared: arguments falling silent. Because silence is when everyone agrees, and agreement is death for knowledge. When a Roman envoy visited Alexandria 10 years later, he asked, "Why is it so noisy here?" In Rome, scholars speak quietly, like mice. Eratosthenes showed him the hall where 10 people shouted about the universe's shape and smirked, "Because mice fear cats, we don't." The envoy didn't get the joke, but wrote it in his notebook. Later, of course, lost it at the port. But someone found it and brought to the library. There it was, copied, with a comment. Author apparently confused mice and scholars. But what if he's right? So the library lived, not in sages' silence, but in argument's roar. Because every argument isn't an end. It's the start of a new line in a scroll no one has written yet. And beyond the Mausion's walls, the wind whispered, "Argue. Error. Copy. As long as there's a question, there's an answer. Even if it lies in the next argument." In times when men believed women couldn't tell a scroll from a rag, and philosophers debated whether ladies had souls, a shadow appeared in Alexandria. Not the kind cast by columns at noon, but one that slipped between the library's shelves like a cat between soldiers' legs. Her name was Hatshepsut, a name she left in the past, along with skirts and perfumes. Now she was Harmon, son of an Egyptian merchant, scribe's apprentice, with ink-stained fingers and a gaze that avoided meeting others. Entering the library as a woman was as difficult as convincing the Nile to flow backward. There were no men-only rules here. They weren't needed. It was enough to look at togas-wearing scholars quoting Homer like market traders to understand. This was a place for those born with the right gender. But Hatshepsut knew, if you want to change something, start by becoming invisible. She cropped her hair, bound her chest with linen, rubbed dust on her face to hide soft features, and learned to walk so her step wouldn't reveal femininity. She also learned to cough loudly. Men did it every 5 minutes, as if proving they existed. Her first day in the library nearly became her last. She tripped over the threshold like a newborn calf and dropped a stack of scrolls. Scribes laughed. "Here you go, Harmon. Even papyrus is heavier than your brain." She blushed, but remembered her mother's warning. If you blush, you're dead. Instead, she rudely replied, "At least my brain isn't stuffed with straw like yours." Laughter grew louder, but now friendly. That's how she entered their world. Hatshepsut didn't seek glory. She came for one thing, a scroll written by her ancestors, Egyptian priestesses of Isis. It contained healing recipes known only to women, how to stop bleeding with tree bark, ease childbirth pain, heal wounds without scarring. Men's books spoke of war and gods, but were silent about surviving after it. This scroll was kept in the medicine hall, but access was limited to the chosen, those wearing white robes and shaving beards. For weeks, she observed, learned to recognize guards' footsteps, memorized when the chief keeper left for lunch, how wind rustled scrolls at noon. She noticed, every Friday, when sun hit windows, dust danced in the air, and guards fell asleep resting heads on tables. That's when she decided to act. At night, under moonlight, Hatshepsut crept into the medicine hall. Heart pounded so loudly it seemed mice could hear it. But mice, as usual, were busy, gnawing scroll edges. She found the right cabinet, shelf marked herbs and poisons. There lay a scroll tied with blue ribbon, Isis's color. Hands trembled, but she took it. Then heard footsteps. It was Zenodot, library head. Not young, not old, with a face lined like the Nile's map. He stood in the doorway, looking at her like an owl at a mouse. Hatshepsut froze. Thoughts flashed. Run, drop the scroll, shout, "It's a mistake." But he didn't move. Just slowly approached, took the scroll from her hands, and unrolled it. Read several lines, then looked at her, not angrily, but as if seeing through the lie like thin papyrus. Next morning, Hatshepsut expected punishment. She should have been expelled, whipped, sent home in disgrace. But instead, Zenodot invited her to his office, placed a new scroll before her, blank, and pointed to a chair. She sat, trembling. He wrote, "Tomorrow you start copying. No mention of yesterday, no threats, just a scroll and a chair." Later she understood. He'd known everything from the start. Her short nails, women painted theirs. Clumsy attempts to speak in a hoarse voice, lavender scent seeping through dust. But he stayed silent, because he saw how she studied complex formulas at night, erased mistakes until fingers bled, handled scrolls as if they were children. Since then, Hatshepsut stopped being Harmon. She remained in the library, but now, without mask. She wasn't greeted with applause. Some scholars left the hall when she entered. Others whispered, "A A woman here? She can't even hold a pen, but she held it tighter than many of them. Her first scroll, that very one with priestesses' recipes, was copied 10 times. It hung in the medicine hall next to Hippocrates' works. Only now it contained not just men's knowledge of bloodletting, but women's. How to heal wounds without prayers. Scribes who once laughed at her now asked to teach them reading Egyptian symbols. "How do you do it?" they asked. She replied, "Same way you do. Just look at paper, not your neighbor's chest." But not everything was smooth. Once in the geography hall, she spotted an error on a map. A river actually flowing east was drawn west. When she pointed it out, an old geographer snorted, "A woman teaching me science?" Next, you'll say the Nile flows upward. She silently produced a scroll with caravanners' records showing, "It turns here." Because of mountains. The geographer looked and muttered, "Maybe you're right. But next time, stay silent until asked." She stayed silent. But not always. Sometimes, when scholars argued about the world's workings, she added her opinion. Not loudly, but clearly, like a drop of water in the desert, small but noticeable. Gradually, her voice was heard. Not because it grew louder, but because words were precise as a knife's strike. Once a scroll arrived from India about how children are born. Men's hands trembled copying it. This is indecent. We're scholars, not midwives. Hatshepsut took the scroll and wrote in the margin, "If you don't know how children are born, how study their illnesses?" Scribes froze. Then one of them, the boldest, added, "And she's right." Since then, a new section appeared in the medicine hall, birth and life. Not everyone accepted the changes. In Athens, philosophers wrote angry letters. You allow women access to knowledge? What next? Horses ruling cities. In Rome, they joked, Egyptians love cats so much. Now cats will become scholars. But in Alexandria, rains came, scrolls got damp, and Hatshepsut knew how to dry them. Arguments arose, and she found forgotten formulas in old texts. Gradually, her presence stopped being news. Now it was normal. Once Sosibius, the scribe who once mixed 2 and 3, asked her, "Why didn't Zenodot expel you?" She smiled, because he understood. Knowledge has no gender. It has a price, and the price is preserving it. Sosibius nodded. That same day, he wrote in his diary, "Today, Hatshepsut explained Egyptian hieroglyphs to me. Turns out they resemble birds. Should have asked earlier." Zenodot died 5 years later. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but quietly like a dying lamp. Before death, he gathered all library keepers, looked at Hatshepsut and said only, "Continue." She nodded and continued. Now she herself took new apprentices. Didn't ask whether man or woman stood before her. Asked, "Can you read? Can you write? Can you err and admit it?" Those answering yes received a chair and scroll. Others left whispering, "The library smells of lavender." Strange. Sometimes, of course, those rejecting change appeared. Once an old soldier entered the hall demanding removal of this woman from sacred space. Hatshepsut didn't argue, simply gave him a scroll with a scorpion sting remedy. "Read it," she said, "and say where the mistake is." The soldier read, frowned, then threw the scroll. "All correct, but I still disapprove." She smiled. "At least your wife will live. Approval comes second." Over time, the library became a different place. Not perfect, but alive. Here people argued, erred, copied, and knew. Whoever brings knowledge is a friend, even if he or she comes from shadow. Once a ship arrived from a distant land. Captain brought a scroll in an unknown language. Scholars puzzled over it for weeks. Then Hatshepsut took it, ran a finger over symbols and said, "This is my grandmother's language. She wrote this so men wouldn't understand." It turned out to be healing herb recipes from Red Sea shores. They were copied, added to the medicine hall, and the captain, learning a woman deciphered the scroll, laughed long. "In my country, women command ships." "And here," Hatshepsut replied, "knowledge commands." When a new king came to Alexandria years later, he asked, "Why so many women here?" They showed him the medicine hall where they taught young doctors. "Because," said an old scribe, "without them, you wouldn't have lived to ask this question." The king smirked and left, but next day sent a gift, a bag of lavender. So the library lived, not in silence ruled by prejudice, but in noise ruled by truth. Sometimes rough, sometimes gentle, but always its own. And wind in the windows whispered, "If knowledge is light, then shadow isn't an enemy. It only helps see where morning begins." In those years when the library no longer smelled only of lavender and ink, but also something fading, like old papyrus in sun, a special calm reigned there. Not the calm after storm, but the calm before sunset. Aristophanes, keeper of the philosophy hall, no longer rose from the mat by the window. His hands, once writing letters straighter than map lines, now trembled like leaves in wind. They said he was ill, but his illness was strange. Not fever, not wound, just time finally catching up with one who considered it a friend. One morning, a merchant stormed into the library, not like those arriving by ship, boasting scrolls for gold. This one was dirty as if he'd eaten dust for a week, smelling of fish long overdue for disposal. In his hands, he clutched a papyrus wrapped in a rag stained like wine or blood. "This is the last," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Scribes exchanged glances. Last what? Last apple? Last breath? But the merchant stayed silent until given a bag of silver. Then he threw the scroll on the table and left like a man who sold not just goods, but conscience. The scroll was old. No title, only a barely visible signature. Aristotle. Not the Aristotle whose works already lay in the philosophy hall, but the one who wrote so even gods probably stopped thinking while listening. But this wasn't metaphysics or Nicomachean ethics. It was a text no one knew. On the soul of animals. Aristophanes, hearing this, sat up for the first time in a month. His eyes, dull as embers after fire, suddenly lit up. He took the scroll like a newborn, afraid it would crumble to dust. And so it was. Papyrus crumbled under fingers. Letters faded, barely legible in places. But Aristophanes read like one reading a dying friend's last words. Slowly, painfully, hoping to remember something. An hour later, he looked up, tears on his face. Not from weakness, not from pain, from the realization the world had just learned. Aristotle wrote not only about humans, he wrote about how eagles think, why cats see in darkness, how bees find flowers, about how soul, not man's privilege, but a guest visiting all living things. Scribes standing around fell silent. They were used to arguments, mistakes, jokes about square hippos. But here there was no room for jokes. Here lay the end of one era and beginning of another. Aristophanes gave the order, not loudly, not royally, just whispered, "Copy it." In 3 days. In the library they knew, 3 days was time enough to achieve the impossible or die. Scribes nodded. They'd already seen how the old man looked at the scroll, like a farewell. Work began. Sosibius, who once mixed 2 and 3, now led the group. He chose the most skilled, those whose hands didn't shake, whose eyes still saw in darkness. The scroll was placed on a stand lit by lamps, not for warmth, but for light that might prolong the text's life. First page copied in an hour, but Aristophanes stopped them. Here's a mistake. Letter A written bolder than needed. Aristotle never wrote like this, he whispered. Had to erase and start again. Night. Lamps burned like stars in the desert. Scribes changed every 2 hours, but Aristophanes didn't sleep. He sat nearby, holding the scroll like its warmth could return letters to papyrus. Sometimes he pointed to a line, word missing here. Sometimes stayed silent, but his look said, "You didn't understand." One young scribe, nervous, dropped an inkwell. Dark stain spread across fresh text. Everyone froze. Aristophanes looked at the stain, then at the youth and said, "Now it's part of history," and smiled, for the first time in a week. By second night, Aristophanes lay down. Not to sleep, just closed eyes as if gathering strength. Scribes worked quieter, afraid to disturb his rest. But by noon, he sat up again. In his hands, the scroll. He kept reading, and suddenly froze. Fingers gripped papyrus, sweat beads on forehead. Sosibius ran over. Aristophanes pointed to a line. "This is important," and collapsed. They carried him to a tent by the library. The healer said, "He won't last till morning." But Aristophanes opened his eyes and whispered, "Till morning, we'll manage." No one asked what he meant. All knew it wasn't about him. Third day, final pages. Scroll crumbled faster than they wrote. Sometimes they had to piece fragments together like a puzzle to restore a word. One scribe, trying to speed up, wrote mouse instead of soul. Sosibius erased the mistake, but his hand shook. "If he dies while we err." Another, to stay awake, chewed tree bark, bitter as truth. Someone whispered prayers, though not believing in gods. By evening, the text was ready. Final line. "For the soul of an animal is not man's shadow, but his mirror." Scribes folded the copy, placed it next to the original. Aristophanes, hearing this, asked for the scroll. He ran a finger over letters like a blind man reading through skin, then nodded, and died. No one cried. Not because there was no grief, but because at that moment all understood. Death isn't an end. It's just a pause between lines. Sosibius took the copy, carried it to the philosophy hall, and placed it next to Aristotle's works. The original was placed in Aristophanes' coffin. "Let him take what he loved," Zenodot said. But the story didn't end. Next day, Eratosthenes came to the library. He took the copy, read it overnight, and declared, "This will change everything." And it did. Philosophers who once argued whether slaves had souls now asked, "Do ants have souls?" Doctors treating humans began studying how animals heal wounds. Even fishermen stopped considering birds stupid. They knew where to find fish. Sosibius, now philosophy hall keeper, sometimes took the scroll and thought, "Perhaps knowledge isn't what's written. It's what makes you search further." Once he noticed an error in the copy. On one page, cat was written as kitty. He didn't correct it. Let it stay. As a reminder, even in sacred text, human tremor finds its place. Years passed. The library grew, argued, burned, and revived, and the scroll on the soul of animals lay in the philosophy hall, until one day a mad poet stole it. But a month later, he returned it, saying, "I thought it was a secret. Turned out it's truth." Sometimes, though, truth scares more than mystery, and in dust under the table where Aristophanes once sat, a papyrus fragment still lies. On it, one letter. Not A, not O, just a dot, like the start of a new sentence, or like a tear's trace. That night, when fire reached the port, the wind sang a song known only to ruined cities. Not a howl, not a scream. A quiet, sinister hiss like a snake slithering through ash. Ships burned like torches at a god's festival, and flames, caught by wind, already licked the library's walls. Someone dropped a lamp, or it was Caesar's gift. War rarely arrives with flower bouquets, but this time it came with fire. So Sosibius, now no longer scribe but philosophy hall keeper, stood by the window watching the sky redden. His fingers, once trembling over scrolls, were now motionless as stone. He knew this wasn't just fire. It was the end. Not the kind coming with quiet sigh, but the kind crashing in with roar and leaving only questions behind. How many scrolls can we save? He thought. How many mistakes have we already made? How many more will we make? Panic erupted in the library. Not the morning kind when scribes rush to their tables, but the kind born when time clenches into a fist. Someone ran to the Nile with buckets, someone to scrolls, someone just stood watching fire like a verdict. Sosibius didn't run. He gathered those who still believed something could be saved. Not heroes, not warriors, men with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes. Take scrolls, he said, but not the easiest to reach. The ones most important to forget. First, Aristotle's works were hidden. Not metaphysics, not ethics, but that very scroll, On the Soul of Animals. Aristophanes read before dying. It was wrapped in oil, placed in a clay jar, and buried under a palm tree by Serapis Temple. If found, Sosibius whispered, let them think it's wine. Nearby were hidden Indian recipes from Hatshepsut, Eratosthenes' map. Even that very scroll with monkeys the collector once mistook for alphabet. Everything that didn't fit in jars was packed in salt bags to keep sand from erasing letters. But not everything went as planned. One scribe, young and too proud, tried to carry too much. His bag tore, scrolls scattered across the floor. He tried gathering them, but fire was already close. In the end, he dropped everything and ran, leaving fingerprints on papyri like final greetings. Another, conversely, took only one scroll, on growing gold from clay. What if it's true, he thought, then threw it into the Nile. No, still nonsense. Sosibius calmly gathered his things. Not scrolls, he knew they couldn't be carried, but Aristarchus's staff, the very one who believed in flat earth, the staff where Theocritus once hid the Indian scroll. Now it was empty, but Sosibius felt emptiness, also memory. He checked if anyone remained in the halls, found an old scribe sitting hugging a scroll like a child. Go, Sosibius said. Your hands can still write. He shook his head. My hands can do nothing now, but I won't leave. Sosibius didn't argue. Some choose to die with books, others with people. By morning, fire reached the library. Not all, part of the building survived like a tooth after battle, but enough to erase what people built over centuries. Scrolls that survived deserts and seas died from a spark fallen from sky. Somewhere burned eclipse tables, somewhere priestesses' recipes, somewhere silly notes about square hippos, all mixed in smoke like words in delirium. Sosibius stood on the shore watching the fire. In his hands, staff and a bag with final scrolls. He didn't cry. Not because there was no grief, but because grief, luxury for those still believing in endings. He knew, knowledge doesn't die. It just changes form. Sometimes becomes ash. Sometimes sand under feet. Sometimes words children repeat by the well. A week later, he sailed away. Not alone, with him were those still holding inkwells. Their ship was small as a thought, but held everything left. Scroll copies, argument records, even that very scroll with monkeys. Someone asked, "Where are we sailing?" Sosibius didn't answer. He just looked at the horizon where Earth curved like an arc. Years passed. The library turned to ruins. Sand covered its steps. Wind blew last letters from walls. Sometimes tourists came to Alexandria, pointed at charred columns saying, "This was the end." But there are no ends, only pauses. 100 years later, an archaeologist came to Alexandria. Not famous, not rich, just a man believing ash could tell a story. He dug where shelves once stood, finding papyrus fragments blackened by fire. One piece was so small it could hide in a palm. On it, just 2 letters. So. The archaeologist smiled. It was enough. 1,000 years later, a blog appeared online. A young man wrote about how ancient Greeks erred in mathematics. In comments, someone wrote, "Have you tried reading their scrolls?" The man laughed. "What scrolls? They've long been gone." But that same day, he found a scan in archives. A papyrus fragment marked Alexandria. On it, a formula he sought. Signature: Sosibius, error corrected. Knowledge doesn't disappear. It just waits. Sosibius died in a small island town. Not in a tomb, not with monument, but in a simple bed with papyrus in hand. Next morning, his staff lay by the door, and inside, a scroll written by his hand. It contained no wise thoughts, just one phrase. "If you're reading this, I haven't died." That scroll was copied, then again, and again. Today it lies in the new library, the one built where the old stood, where fire once burned, lamps now shine, where ash once smelled, now coffee aroma fills air, and everyone entering feels, this isn't the end, this is the beginning. Sometimes, though, beginnings come with mistakes. Once a student mixed letters and wrote knowing instead of knowledge. The teacher wanted to erase the error, but then changed his mind. "Let it stay," he said. "What if it's a new word?" So the library lives, not in stone, not in papyrus, but in people continuing to write. Even if hands tremble, even if ink dries, even if someone drops a lamp at the port. Because knowledge isn't what's stored on a shelf. It's what's passed hand to hand, like a torch in darkness. And in sand under ruins, a jar still lies. Inside, a scroll no one has found. Perhaps it'll be found tomorrow. Perhaps in 1,000 years. Or maybe it's no longer important. Because what matters isn't where knowledge lies. What matters is that it exists.
From the moment he was born, a boy from a samurai family found himself in a special position, though he did not feel extraordinary, because everything that happened to him was seen as part of the natural order, something that simply was. His arrival into the world was not marked by grand celebrations or feasts, as it sometimes was in other cultures, where the birth of an heir could become an occasion for loud festivities. In a samurai household, things were quiet and modest, yet every gesture, every action carried deep meaning and symbolic weight, as if from the very first hours of life, the boy was already stepping onto a path that all members of his class were expected to follow. He was given a name, not just a pleasant-sounding one, but one that carried an idea: endurance, loyalty, inner strength, or righteousness. This name became a kind of reminder of who he was meant to become, as though a lifelong program was being laid within him from the very beginning, a program that allowed no room for weakness, doubt, or self-indulgent searching. Near the infant, despite his helplessness and smallness, a short sword, the wakizashi, was often placed, not for him to play with, but so that this object, which would later become a symbol of honor and the warrior's soul, was part of his world from the start. It was not merely a blade, but a promise of the future, a constant reminder of a destiny that could not be ignored. Over time, the boy grew accustomed to its presence, and when he one day first held a wooden training sword in his hands, it did not feel new or frightening, but rather like a continuation of something that had always been with him. By the age of 3, he was already being taught things that in other cultures would have been considered inappropriate for a child: to sit still, to breathe evenly, to stay focused, not to react to fear. He would be seated on a mat, eyes closed, listening to the rustle of the wind or the silence of the room, and if he opened his eyes too soon, trembled, or lost concentration, he would be asked to begin again, sometimes again and again, until he learned to maintain a state of calm. This was not cruelty in the usual sense, but rather preparation for a life in which emotions could not be allowed to run wild, where every movement, every action had to be deliberate, and fear was not an excuse to flee, but a challenge to be overcome. If he fell or was frightened, he was not comforted, but reminded that a samurai must not show weakness, even if he felt afraid inside, because weakness was not merely a personal flaw, it was a risk to the family, to the lord, to the entire order he would one day be sworn to protect. By the age of 5, physical and spiritual exercises were joined by lessons in writing and reading. He learned to write kanji, not merely as a skill, but choosing those characters associated with duty, patience, and honor, and each time he formed a symbol, he was not just training his hand, but absorbing its meaning, as though each stroke reinforced a certain quality within him. He was given not fairy tales or legends of heroes to read, but serious texts, the teachings of Confucius, Buddhist parables, the codes of conduct for samurai, and he listened to how important it was to be loyal to his lord, to respect his elders, to understand that the family's honor was more valuable than his own life. These were not abstract ideas spoken in passing, but part of daily life, part of what he heard every day, as though repetition made them a part of himself. Girls from samurai families lived in a similarly strict atmosphere, though their path was different. They were not trained to fight alongside their brothers, but they were expected to handle a knife, to know how to manage a household, raise children, and uphold the family's honor. They too were taught discipline, modesty, and self-control, and if enemies ever broke into the home, they were to either defend themselves or commit seppuku, to avoid capture and bring no shame to their husband or father. For them, as for the men, honor was not just a word, but the highest value, one that could not be betrayed. By the age of 7, the boy was formally sent to study, and from that point on, his life became even more structured and demanding. He began to learn martial arts, bujei, not only swordsmanship, which received special attention, but also archery, spear fighting, horsemanship, and the study of military treatises that explored strategy, tactics, and the moral dilemmas of the warrior. At the same time, he was not deprived of other skills considered essential for a cultivated person. He learned to write poetry, especially haiku about nature and fleeting moments of existence. He practiced calligraphy and took part in the tea ceremony, where every movement was carefully considered and where the focus was not on the tea itself, but on the state of mind, concentration, and respect for the guest. A samurai could not be merely strong, he had to be composed, intelligent, cultured, capable of silence when needed, and speech only when truly necessary. At the same time, in Europe, a boy from a feudal family also began his training, but it was arranged differently. He was sent to another lord's castle to serve as a page, cleaning armor, carrying wine, learning dances, music, and courtly manners, and he was raised to become a future knight, a man of the court, able to fight and charm ladies alike. Their courage and loyalty were valued, but so too was the ability to be gallant, elegant, and noticeable. He was taught not just to fight, but to be a hero whose deeds would be sung in poems. In Japan, however, the hero did not seek glory, he sought not to fail, not to bring shame, to fulfill his duty even if no one ever saw it. So the samurai's path began, not with loud words or grand deeds, but with quiet, almost invisible steps, discipline, the ability to sit, to be silent, to breathe, to write characters, to train again and again until each movement became perfect. It was not inspiration, but shaping, not a desire for fame, but readiness to serve, to face death, to live a life in which every day he had to remember, you are not just a person, you are a bearer of duty, and that duty is more important than anything. When the boy turned 7, the next stage of his life began, a period of systematic training designed not merely to make him a warrior, but a man capable of serving his lord in every sense. He was placed under the care of a teacher, often a former samurai known for discipline and skill, and from that moment, each day became part of a strict, almost monastic routine. Mornings began long before sunrise, with meditation, light exercise, and the cleansing of both body and mind. He was expected to rise with the first light, without complaint, without delay. This was not simply a habit, but the cultivation of willpower, the ability to command the body through the mind. After the morning exercises came lessons. He learned swordsmanship, not for the sake of winning duels, but for the perfection of movement, for inner balance. Every cut, every step, every stance was repeated hundreds of times until it became as natural as breathing. The teacher did not praise success, but pointed out errors with firmness, and the boy understood praise was a weakness, while correction was the path to mastery. He was not only learning to strike, but to feel how the sword became an extension of his arm, how blade and man merged into one. Alongside this, he trained in other martial arts, archery, spear fighting, and unarmed defense. He practiced in full armor, in heat and cold, on slippery ground, in the rain, so that he would grow accustomed to any condition. He was not shielded from hardship, on the contrary, it was deliberately introduced to test how ready he was for real life. If he fell, he got up alone. If he grew tired, he continued. If he wanted to give up, he was reminded that a samurai had no right to weakness. Yet he was not deprived of other aspects of education. He learned to read and write, studied classical Chinese texts, and examined military treatises such as Sun Tzu's The Art of War, learning not only how to fight, but how to think. He was taught strategy, logic, and how to anticipate an opponent's actions. He wrote essays on honor, duty, and the nature of authority, and these were judged not by elegance of style, but by depth of understanding. Eloquence was valued, but only if it came from sincerity. He also studied arts that, at first glance, might seem far removed from war. He learned calligraphy, where every stroke had to be precise, calm, and meaningful. He participated in the tea ceremony, in which every movement was refined to perfection, and where the focus was not on the pleasure of the drink, but on the state of mind, respect for the guest, and the ability to be fully present. He wrote haiku, short poems about nature, fleeting moments, and death, and in them, he learned to see beauty in the simple, the transient, the impermanent. In Europe at the same time, a boy from a feudal family was learning to be noticeable, charming, skilled in conversation. He was valued not only for bravery, but for his ability to please. He might be rough, but if he could speak beautifully of love or recount a heroic deed, he was forgiven. In Japan, however, outward elegance only mattered if there was inner order. The beauty of a movement was important, but only if it came from discipline, not from a desire to impress. So the years passed, one day after another, Exercise after exercise, mistake after mistake, until the boy gradually became what he was meant to be, not merely a master of the sword, but a man in whom strength, intellect, and spirit were in balance. When the boy turned 7, the next stage of his life began, a period of systematic training designed not merely to make him a warrior, but a man capable of serving his lord in every sense. He was placed under the care of a teacher, often a former samurai known for discipline and skill, and from that moment, each day became part of a strict, almost monastic routine. Mornings began long before sunrise, with meditation, light exercise, and the cleansing of both body and mind. He was expected to rise with the first light, without complaint, without delay. This was not simply a habit, but the cultivation of willpower, the ability to command the body through the mind. After the morning exercises came lessons. He learned swordsmanship, not for the sake of winning duels, but for the perfection of movement, for inner balance. Every cut, every step, every stance was repeated hundreds of times until it became as natural as breathing. The teacher did not praise success, but pointed out errors with firmness, and the boy understood praise was a weakness, while correction was the path to mastery. He was not only learning to strike, but to feel how the sword became an extension of his arm, how blade and man merged into one. Alongside this, he trained in other martial arts, archery, spear fighting, and unarmed defense. He practiced in full armor, in heat and cold, on slippery ground, in the rain, so that he would grow accustomed to any condition. He was not shielded from hardship, on the contrary, it was deliberately introduced to test how ready he was for real life. If he fell, he got up alone. If he grew tired, he continued. If he wanted to give up, he was reminded that a samurai had no right to weakness. Yet he was not deprived of other aspects of education. He learned to read and write, studied classical Chinese texts, and examined military treatises such as Sun Tzu's The Art of War, learning not only how to fight, but how to think. He was taught strategy, logic, and how to anticipate an opponent's actions. He wrote essays on honor, duty, and the nature of authority, and these were judged not by elegance of style, but by depth of understanding. Eloquence was valued, but only if it came from sincerity. He also studied arts that, at first glance, might seem far removed from war. He learned calligraphy, where every stroke had to be precise, calm, and meaningful. He participated in the tea ceremony, in which every movement was refined to perfection, and where the focus was not on the pleasure of the drink, but on the state of mind, respect for the guest, and the ability to be fully present. He wrote haiku, short poems about nature, fleeting moments, and death, and in them, he learned to see beauty in the simple, the transient, the impermanent. In Europe at the same time, a boy from a feudal family was learning to be noticeable, charming, skilled in conversation. He was valued not only for bravery, but for his ability to please. He might be rough, but if he could speak beautifully of love or recount a heroic deed, he was forgiven. In Japan, however, outward elegance only mattered if there was inner order. The beauty of a movement was important, but only if it came from discipline, not from a desire to impress. So the years passed, one day after another, exercise after exercise, mistake after mistake, until the boy gradually became what he was meant to be, not merely a master of the sword, but a man in whom strength, intellect, and spirit were in balance. When a young man received his first true sword, the katana, and was formally recognized as a samurai, it did not mean the trials were over. On the contrary, the most important stage now began, life as a warrior in the real world, where every day was a test, where honor was not proclaimed, but proven in small things, in silence, in solitude. His path no longer ended at the training hall or student duties. Now he entered the complex world of service, where his actions, decisions, even his thoughts, had to align with a strict inner code known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. His first posting might be at a daimyo's castle, an administrative center in a province, or even a minor outpost on the border. He became part of a hierarchical structure where everyone knew their place, and where even the smallest deviation from the norm could be noticed and judged. His duties varied. He might stand guard, accompany his lord, attend meetings, handle documentation, or train newcomers. Sometimes he spent entire days at a desk, studying laws, writing reports, reviewing tax records. This might seem far removed from the image of a gleaming sword and thunderous battles, but for a samurai, service was service, whether with a weapon in hand or a brush between the fingers. The key was not to fail, not to make a mistake, not to disrupt the order. His day began early, as it had since childhood. He rose before dawn, performed morning exercises, meditated, checked his weapons, and dressed in plain but formal attire. He wore no bright colors, no jewelry. His appearance was meant to reflect inner restraint. Even his walk, gestures, and manner of speech were refined to perfection, not to impress, but to avoid causing irritation or drawing unnecessary attention. A samurai did not seek to be seen. He sought to be reliable. In Europe at the same time, a knight who had become a full member of the military nobility often lived a very different life. His service was also important, but it was closely tied to public life. He took part in tournaments, feasts, and ceremonies, where his bravery, nobility, and social grace were valued as much as his combat skills. His armor was adorned with crests, his horse richly caparisoned, his cloak embroidered with gold. He was a hero in the eyes of all, and his fame grew with every feat in Japan. However, fame was not encouraged. On the contrary, it was viewed with suspicion. A samurai who boasted of his deeds lost respect. His worth was not measured by how much people spoke of him, but by how flawlessly he fulfilled his duty, even if no one ever saw it. His daily life was filled with rituals. Each morning he might take part in the tea ceremony, not for pleasure, but as an exercise in focus, respect, and inner order. He learned to value the moment, not to rush, not to lose himself in distraction. Even at meals, he followed strict rules, sitting upright, speaking only when necessary, showing no greed. His home, if he had a family, was simple, neat, and free of excess. The samurai's wife also lived by strict rules. She managed the household, raised the children, and upheld the family's honor. She did not go out without reason, did not engage in idle talk, did not show emotion in public. Their marriage was less a union of hearts and more a union of duty. If the samurai had children, he raised them with the same strictness he had known. He did not spoil them, praise them for small achievements, or excuse weakness. He passed on not only skills, but inner discipline, teaching them not to fear, not to complain, not to seek approval. He knew they were the continuation of the line, and upon them would depend whether the family's honor was preserved or lost forever. So he was firm, but not cruel. His firmness was a form of respect for the future. He continued to train every day, even if he was not involved in battle. Swordsmanship, archery, physical conditioning, these remained part of his routine. He knew he could be called to duty at any moment, that an enemy might appear without warning, that his skill might save not only himself, but his lord, his comrades, his family. So he did not allow himself to relax. His body and mind had to remain in constant readiness. Yet he was not deprived of other aspects of life. He wrote poetry, especially haiku, in which he expressed his thoughts on nature, time, and death. He practiced calligraphy, not as art, but as a way to calm the mind. He read Buddhist texts, reflecting on the fleeting nature of life and the meaning of service. He might spend hours in silence, watching the garden, listening to the rain, doing nothing, and in that stillness, he found strength. For him, not being busy did not mean being idle. It was time for inner reflection, for restoring balance. In Europe, a knight might also turn to art, write poetry, or play the lute, but it was often tied to admiration for a lady of the heart, a desire to please, to earn a smile. His poetry was filled with love, dreams, passion. The samurai's poetry was colder, more restrained. It spoke of the moon, the wind, a falling cherry blossom. It did not glorify emotion, but accepted it as part of existence, as something fleeting, a reminder that all things pass, and therefore it was important to live with a clear heart. His attitude toward death remained a key difference from the European warrior. He did not fear death, because since childhood he had known it as a natural part of life. He did not pray for his soul's salvation, as the knight did, nor did he hope for heaven. He learned to accept death as inevitable, as a possible end to any day. If he lost a battle, if his lord died, if he made a serious mistake, he knew he must answer. And the answer could only be one: seppuku, ritual suicide performed with dignity, in front of witnesses, according to strict rules. This was not an act of despair. It was the final act of honor, a way to preserve dignity when nothing else could be set right. He did not perform seppuku out of fear of punishment. He did it to avoid shaming his family, to show that he acknowledged his fault, that he was willing to pay the highest price. It was not an act of weakness, but of strength. And while in Europe this might seem barbaric, in Japan it was part of a system in which honor was more important than life. So passed his adult life, not in loud feats, not in feasts, not in love intrigues, but in silence, in service, in constant work on the self. He did not seek fame. He sought only that, at the end of the day, looking at the moon beyond the window, he could say to himself, "I did not fail. I fulfilled my duty." And that was enough. The life of the samurai was not only a matter of hands and sword, but of spirit. His actions, decisions, and attitude toward life and death were shaped not merely by tradition, but by deep philosophical and religious ideas that had been woven into him since childhood and remained with him to the end. Unlike the European knight, whose worldview was built largely upon Christian faith, with its concepts of sin, salvation, and eternal life, the samurai drew strength from a blend of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. These three traditions, which might seem contradictory, came together in Japan to form a single inner space, offering the warrior stability even when chaos and death surrounded him. Central to his spiritual world was Buddhism, particularly the Zen school. It did not ask the samurai to pray, to worship, or to believe in gods. Instead, it taught silence, focus, and acceptance. Through meditation, through the repetition of the same movements, through a constant return to the present moment, he learned to master his mind, not allowing fear, anger, or doubt to take control. For a warrior who might find himself in battle at any moment, this was not mere exercise, it was survival. A mind overwhelmed by emotion hesitates. And in battle, a single hesitation means death. Thus, Zen was not philosophy for scholars, but practice for warriors. He learned not to think, but to be. Not to plan, but to respond. Not to fear, but to accept. When he sat in meditation, he asked for nothing. He simply was. And in that stillness, that near emptiness, he found a strength that could not be put into words. It was not the absence of thought, but the clarity of it, as if the mind had become a mirror, clean, calm, reflecting reality without distortion. In Europe, the knight also sought inner strength, but in a different way. He prayed. Every morning, before battle, at the hour of death, he turned to God. His faith was personal, emotional, filled with fear and hope. He feared hell, dreamed of heaven, and repented of his sins. His conscience was under the constant watch of the church, and he strove to live so that his soul would be ready for judgment. For him, faith was a shield and guide, protecting him in battle and leading him after death. The samurai had no such shield. He had no divine judgment, no promise of eternal life. Instead, he had responsibility to himself, to his lord, to his honor. Confucianism gave him structure. It did not speak of the afterlife, but insisted on order in this world, respect for elders, loyalty to one's lord, proper relationships between people. The samurai learned to see himself not as an individual seeking happiness, but as a link in a chain, part of a family, a class, a state. His duty was not a choice, it was a given, like breath, like heartbeat. He did not ask whether he wanted to serve. He knew he must. And in this obedience, not servile, but conscious, he found freedom. Freedom from doubt, from selfishness, from the fear of being misunderstood. Taoism, though less visible in daily life, was also present in his mind. It taught going with the flow, not resisting life, not struggling against what could not be changed. The samurai knew, all things pass. Power, glory, even life itself, everything was temporary. Rather than fight this truth, he learned to accept it. He wrote poems about falling cherry blossoms, mist over the river, an old bridge, not because they were beautiful, but because they reminded him all is fleeting. And in that transience, he found beauty in beauty, comfort. Interestingly, his faith did not require renunciation of the world. He did not retreat to a monastery. He did not abandon family, service, or weapons. On the contrary, he sought enlightenment in the everyday. In the movement of the sword. In the tea ceremony. In the morning silence. In the ability not to rush. For him, spirituality was not separate from life, it was life, refined to perfection. The European knight, by contrast, often saw spirituality as the opposite of worldly life. He admired monks who had given up battle, family, and wealth. He dreamed of heavens where there would be no wars, no need to fight. His ideal was to leave the world. The samurai's ideal was to remain in it, but with a pure heart, a clear mind, and readiness to give everything at any moment. His attitude toward death was a direct consequence of this philosophy. He did not fear dying, because he knew death was not an end, but a transition, part of the natural order. He did not pray for his soul's salvation, because he did not see the soul as a separate entity awaiting reward or punishment. He saw himself as part of the whole, like a drop in the ocean. And when the drop vanishes, the ocean remains. So he could die calmly, even with a smile. He did not beg for mercy. He did not cry out. He simply completed what he had begun. Before death, he might write a haiku, a short poem expressing his view of the end. These verses were not complaints. They were acceptance. Life is like morning mist, appearing, then gone. How sad I didn't finish my tea. Or, the moon shines so clearly. Today I will die. I hope the wind doesn't rise. There was no fear in them. There was simplicity, modesty, love for the moment. He died not as a hero, but as a man who had played his part to the end. Thus, the inner world of the samurai was not a chaos of emotions, not a struggle with consciences in the night, but a constant work upon himself, a striving for balance, order, and purity of intention. He did not seek happiness. He sought a life of dignity. And if, at the end, he could say, "I did not dishonor myself," that was enough. For the samurai, death was not a taboo, not something frightening to be pushed aside or feared in the silence of night. On the contrary, it was part of his daily awareness from childhood. He did not avoid thoughts of it, he prepared for it, as an inevitable part of the path, as the final note in life that must sound with dignity. His attitude toward death was not grim, nor was it careless. It was acceptance, refined over years of discipline, meditation, and reflection on the fleeting nature of life. He knew to die was not a tragedy. The tragedy was to die without honor. If he lost in battle, if his lord died, if he made a serious mistake that brought shame, he understood that he faced not a choice between life and death, but between dishonor and honor. And this choice was clear. He was to die. Not by the enemy's hand, not by accident, not in agony, but voluntarily, by his own decision, in a prescribed manner. Thus arose the ritual of seppuku, ritual suicide, which in the Western world was often seen as brutality, but in Japan was the highest expression of dignity, an act of final freedom. Seppuku was not carried out in anger or despair. It was a calm, deliberate act, conducted according to strict ritual. The samurai dressed in white, the color of purity and death. He sat in a prescribed posture, facing north, as tradition required. Before him was placed a short sword, the wakizashi. He wrote a farewell poem, often in the form of a haiku, expressing his thoughts on life, death, and duty. This was not a farewell to loved ones, but the final word of a warrior, in which there must be no fear, complaint, or regret. Only acceptance, modesty, gratitude for the chance to serve. Then he struck, cutting his abdomen from right to left, then upward, making a motion symbolizing the opening of the inner self, a demonstration of the soul's purity. This act was excruciatingly painful, yet the samurai was not to cry out. He was to remain calm until the end. To shorten suffering, a kaishakunin, an assistant, usually a close friend or comrade, stood nearby, ready to deliver a single, precise sword stroke to decapitate the samurai immediately after the ritual began. This was not murder, it was an act of mercy and respect. Interestingly, seppuku was not a punishment imposed from above. It might be suggested, but it was carried out by one's own will. It was not a sentence, but responsibility that the samurai took upon himself. Even if no one knew of his mistake, he might still perform seppuku, because he knew. Honesty before oneself was more important than external recognition. Here lay a deep difference from European morality, where shame could be hidden, atoned for through prayer or service. In Europe, a knight who found himself in a shameful situation, such as losing a tournament, being betrayed by a lady, or accused of cowardice, might suffer a blow to reputation, but not a death sentence. He might retire to a monastery, repent, or serve in a crusade to atone for guilt. His path led to redemption, to regaining trust. In Japan, however, the path was different: no honor, no existence. Shame could not be redeemed. It could only be erased by death. Sometimes seppuku was performed not for fault, but as an act of loyalty. When a lord died, his devoted samurai might follow him in death, not out of despair, but as the final expression of fidelity. This was known as tsuigu kuon, and though later banned, in earlier times it was considered the highest virtue. The samurai did not wish to live in a world without his master. His service did not end with his lord's death, it ended with it. Even in peacetime, when there was no war, death remained part of the samurai's life. He knew he might be called at any moment, that his duty might demand the final sacrifice. He did not fear this. He prepared for it. In his home, the sword was always clean, sharp, ready for use, not only for battle, but for ritual. He did not hide it. He did not fear it. The sword was not only a weapon, but a passage to another life. When a samurai died a natural death, from illness or old age, he did so with the same calm. He did not cry out, beg for help, or plead for more time. He might ask for tea, write a final poem, bid farewell to his family, but without tears, without drama. He saw death as the natural concluding act, as a return to the flow of life. His funeral was modest. No loud weeping, no lavish feasts. The body was cremated or buried in a simple grave. On the stone only the name and dates might be carved, nothing more. He was not glorified. He was respected. His last words, if recorded, were rarely about glory, feats, or enemies. More often, they were about simple things: the moon, the garden, how good it would be to finish his tea. In this lay the essence of his philosophy: life is not measured by the number of deeds, but by the quality of the soul. He did not seek immortality through fame. He sought only that his family's name remain untarnished. Thus the samurai died, not with a cry, not with curses, not with pleas, but with dignity, clarity, and a sense of completion. He did not fear death, because he had lived in such a way as to face it without shame. When a samurai died, his life did not turn into a loud legend, nor did it become the subject of ballads sung to lute music in castle halls, as was often the case with European knights. His deeds, if he had any, were rarely described in detail, not celebrated in folk songs, not turned into widespread fame. His name might not even reach the next generation. But this did not mean he was forgotten. On the contrary, he remained in memory not as a hero, but as an example, a living embodiment of duty, honor, and restraint, and this memory was passed not through songs, but through silence, through tradition, through the behavior of those who came after him. His grave was simple. No ornate headstones, no life-sized sculptures, no lengthy inscriptions about heroic feats. More often, just a stone with his name, dates of life, and perhaps a short phrase about loyalty or service. Sometimes a small altar stood nearby, where relatives left tea, flowers, or rice. But there was no wailing, no dramatic grief, no desire to glorify the fallen. Instead, quiet recognition of the fact: he lived, he served, he left. And that was enough. His legacy was not sought in chronicles or legends. It lived in how his children behaved in society, how his wife managed the household, how his students continued their training. It was in the fact that no one dishonored the family, that traditions were preserved, that honor remained intact. For the samurai, memory was not measured by loudness, but by depth. He did not wish to be spoken of. He wished to be repeated, not in glory, but in spirit. Sometimes, if he performed a particularly noble act, such as dying while protecting his lord, or committing seppuku for a mistake no one else noticed, his story was passed down orally, from teacher to student, from father to son. These accounts were not embellished. There was no magic, no miracles. But there was the power of example. They were not told as once a great warrior defeated 100 enemies, but as a samurai, knowing he had broken a promise, left with dignity. And no one else ever knew about it. Such stories did not inspire feats of bravery, they taught not to fail. They reminded, honor is what you protect, even when no one is watching. In Europe, however, memory of the knight was built differently. His death in battle might become the subject of a poem. His name was carved into armor, his crest hung in the castle hall, his deeds retold at court. He was celebrated. He was held up as an example to young squires. His courage, nobility, love for a lady became part of his legend. For the knight, memory was external, it lived in words, in songs, in visual images. He wanted to be remembered. The samurai wanted to be understood, even if his name was forgotten. His legacy did not vanish with his death. It continued to live in everyday life. In the upright posture of his son. In the quiet endurance of his wife. In the way his student held a sword, sat down, answered a question. It lived in the tea ceremony, in calligraphy, in haiku about the moon, in everything that required focus, respect, inner order. The samurai did not leave behind wealth or titles, he left a model of behavior, meant to be reenacted, not repeated in words. Interestingly, even in peacetime, when war ceased and the samurai's role became increasingly bureaucratic, his ideals did not disappear. They transformed. His discipline, modesty, self-control became the foundation for future generations, not only warriors, but also officials, teachers, and masters of art. In Japan today, one can still meet people who speak softly, move smoothly, and remain composed under stress, and in this, one senses the spirit of the samurai, not as an archaic relic, but as a living part of culture. His legacy was not frozen. It was not preserved in museums as a relic, but lived on in martial arts schools, in business ethics, in attitudes toward work. Zen discipline, respect for the teacher, willingness to sacrifice for the common good, these can still be seen today, not in armor, but in offices, factories, and classrooms. Japanese work culture, with its punctuality, responsibility, and modesty, owes much to samurai ideals. Even in art, his influence remains visible. The films of Akira Kurosawa, where warriors speak less than they remain silent, where decisive moments follow long stillness, are not merely cinema, they are continuations of philosophy. They lack pomp, lack loud victories, but carry deep feelings of duty, dignity, and acceptance. Such films do not entertain, they make one reflect. Just like the samurai himself. His image in culture did not become mythical, like the knight with a sword in stone or banners fluttering above his head. He remained human, grounded, close. Not rich, not handsome, not loud, but reliable. And this is precisely why he continues to command respect. People do not dream of becoming a samurai as a legendary hero. But many wish to live as he did, with honor, with discipline, with the ability to stay silent at the right moment. Thus, memory of the samurai did not fade. It did not become a spectacle, nor mere entertainment. It remained in silence, in behavior, in inner order. He did not leave behind loud words. He left an example. And that was more than enough. When one looks at the path of the samurai, from the first cry in a modest estate to the final breath beneath the moon, it seems almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. Not because of the sword, not because of seppuku, not because of strictness, but because this path was built on different foundations than those we are used to. It was not aimed at happiness, self-fulfillment, or freedom of choice. It was aimed at service, honor, and inner order. And in this lies its deep difference, not only from the modern world, but also from other warrior traditions, including the European one. Comparing the path of the samurai and the son of a feudal lord, one sees that both were raised as warriors, both served their masters, both endured trials and battles. But while the European knight sought external recognition, glory, the love of a lady, and a heroic image in the eyes of others, the samurai sought inner harmony, the fulfillment of duty, and a life in which honor did not depend on whether his actions were seen or not. One lived for people. The other lived for duty. One wished to be great. The other wished only not to fail. The European knight, raised in the Christian tradition, sought salvation of the soul, feared hell, and hoped for heaven. His virtue was often tied to repentance, mercy, and faith in God. He could make mistakes, but he could also atone. His path was correctable. The samurai, raised in the world of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Zen, did not seek salvation. He sought balance, purity of intention, and readiness for death. For him, a mistake that brought shame could not be atoned for. It demanded a response, and the only possible response was death. His path was irreversible. Interestingly, both warriors were strict, but in different ways. The knight could be rough, quicker-tempered, even cruel, but if he showed bravery and loyalty, society forgave him much. The samurai, however, had to be restrained, calm, disciplined. His strength was not measured in blows, but in his ability not to react, not to lose temper, not to show weakness. His strictness was not directed at others, but at himself. His upbringing was not aimed at winning a tournament, winning hearts, or achieving loud feats. It was aimed at shaping character, at the ability to live in harmony with oneself, a readiness to serve without seeking recognition. He was not taught to be a hero, but to be a man who keeps his word, even when no one else knows about it. It is precisely in this that lies the samurai's greatest mystery and strength. He did not seek glory. He did not fear death. He did not demand rewards. He simply fulfilled his duty, quietly, strictly, to the end. And in this lies something that continues to command respect even today, in a world that values brightness, success, and self-expression. Comparing these two paths, one sees that neither is better or worse. They are different answers to the same question, how should a warrior live? One answer is through faith, love, and heroism. The other, through discipline, honor, and silence. One is like the hero of a novel. The other, like a 7-word poem. Interestingly, despite all differences, both warriors shared something essential, the understanding of duty. For the knight, duty was tied to God, to his lord, to his lady. For the samurai, it was tied to his master, his family, and his inner code. But in both cases, it was something greater than personal desire. It was a commitment that could not be postponed, ignored, or passed on. It is also important that both were raised in strict conditions, where weakness was not forgiven, and every step mattered. But while in Europe weakness could be atoned for through a heroic act, in Japan it demanded a personal response. This made the samurai more solitary in his decisions. He could not rely on forgiveness. He had to accept the consequences himself. Today, in a world of constant change, shifting values, and uncertainty about whom or what to serve, the samurai's path may seem too severe. But within it lies a point of stability. It reminds us that one can live not for recognition, not for success, but for inner honesty. That what matters is not how much people speak of you, but how you behave when no one is watching. His legacy is not in the sword, not in the armor, not in seppuku. It lies in the ability to be oneself, in the strength to remain calm, in respect for tradition, and in the readiness to give everything for what one believes is right. He was not a model to imitate in detail, but he remains an example of endurance. When we look at the samurai, we do not merely see a warrior from a distant past. We see the possibility of another way of life, one built not on desire, but on responsibility, not on glory, but on dignity. And though we are unlikely to sit in meditation each morning or write haiku before death, there is something in his path that we can take with us, not as a costume, not as a ritual, but as an inner attitude. He did not teach how to win. He taught how not to give up. He did not teach how to be strong. He taught how not to be weak. He did not teach how to be a hero. He taught how to remain oneself, in battle, in silence, in death. And in this lies his enduring strength.